Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this extremely long video is about Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt, Commander and Political Officer for the Tanith First and Only, famously nicknamed Gaunt's Ghosts. And in the video today I'll be painting this model from the 2021 Gaunt's Ghosts set. And I did spot those little mould lines that I missed when I assembled the set for my review, so I'll clean those up now. As there are 6 models to talk about, I don't want to repeat myself and make 6 near identical videos, but in fact there's quite a bit different to talk about with Gaunt, and there's a lot to cover, so I'll have to get stuck in at breakneck speed. As with the rest of the set, I'm painting in some sub-assemblies, off of the base so that I can get to the inside of the cloak, and removing the head so that I can concentrate on that when I paint it by itself. Slate, sand and baking powder glued to the base gives a variety of textures, and all of these parts get a grey prime. And like all of the others, the base gets a dark brown base coat, light brown dry brush, and once again I prove that I can't dry brush for some reason. But here's where things get a little bit different, because for Gaunt, who's the leader of Gaunt's Ghosts, hence the name, I want to paint this model better than any of the others. I've already stepped up from my standard line models to the other models in this specific set, so how do I step up a second time for Gaunt? Well, along comes, for the second time in recent history on this channel, another YouTube channel, Eons of Battle, and they have another painting competition on the way. This time is to paint a hero character, a leader, a boss, and so Gaunt fits perfectly. The challenge part of it is to do something new. A new technique or supply, something that could be scary and risk ruining your best model. Well, I don't believe that it's possible to ruin a model, and I think that's the point of the challenge. So I chose 2 specific things that I have never tried before, and I have applied them to Gaunt. The first of those is to use inks to thin the paint instead of water. And conveniently I have some inks laying about from when I tint resin. Here we see in this fresh part of my wet palette with black paint, and I can thin it with water. A little too much perhaps, but this is what many of us use to paint our models. However, if I instead add ink, which has a different style of pigment, but still having a very low viscosity, the colour should be stronger, more opaque I thought, for the same quantity of the mix painted on. Well, as soon as I started painting the inked down paint, I realised that it wasn't quite as simple as that. I had my mix quite a bit too thin, similar to how I've thinned my paint down too much in my little demonstration there. It was flowing a little too much like a wash, pulling and pooling in places I didn't want it to go. And once the first layer was done, it was somewhat translucent, which was surprising to me. However, this is partly to do with the dilution being so thin, rather than the pigment density. With a second coat, I was able to get a pretty consistent base layer, and with just a few extra bits painted black where I didn't want it. So onto the highlights for the uniform, and I went with blue ink this time. I'm still using the black paint, but diluting it with blue ink I should be able to make a highlight that's still fairly dark. This is somewhat similar to how I've painted the uniforms in the rest of my army, by mixing either a dark green or a grey into the black for the highlight. But for Gaunt I wanted to try this slightly different colour to visually distinguish his Commissar's uniform from the infantry uniform that the rest of the models will be wearing. With this mix going down on an opaque base below, it worked really rather well, and I was starting to get the rich tone of the blue ink showing through, but darkened heavily by the black paint. I realised I was still not getting my mix correct. The viscosity is too thin for me to be able to lay out the highlights how I'm familiar painting them. So for the next part, the shadows of the uniform, I take a blob of my darkest black paint and a fresh blob of black ink, and instead of just mixing them together unrestrained, I'm taking just the tiniest bit of ink and mixing it into the paint. This is very much the same process I use when thinning with water, and this is what I should have started out with the inks. I can also test the mix in the same way by teasing it over the surface of the wet palette. If it pulls back, it's too thin. If it paints over smoothly, then it's good to go, and if it clumps or looks like paste, then it's too thick. I'm painting that on Gaunt's uniform with the same technique I've shown before, painting the underside of every fold or overhang in the fabric, anything that blocks light coming from above. Inks can do quite a few things differently to paints, and often you have to treat them very differently so that they achieve the effect that you're after. But in this case, I'm using ink to dilute paint, so the more I treat it like paint, the better my application is. And so going on to the other parts of the model, I start treating my mixes more like paint. With reds, when I just use normal paint, I tend to undercoat them with brown, and not least because the red tends to have poor coverage and opacity, but also because that opacity allows you to use brown as a shadow colour. So this time with a sepia ink and my dark brown paint, I filled in all of the parts that will be red, and also those that will be brown. Now that I'm only using a small ratio of ink compared to paint, I'm able to control this mix in a very similar way to properly thinned paint. And I'm getting some really clean base coats, even with just a single layer due to the pigmentation of the ink. Surely the different colours and types of inks won't all be the same. Black and brown paints tend to have the best coverage anyway, so this isn't necessarily a universal rule. Layering the red down thinned with red ink, and of course, I've already forgotten the lesson that I just learned. I've used way too much ink and it's pooling and pulling in ways that I just don't want it to. I could dwell on this, but I fix it later on with some more appropriate mixes, and I clean up the edges of the other bits that I went over with their respective paints as well. With some yellow paint added to the mix of red paint and red ink, I'm putting on some highlights. And I can't say I'm a fan of how it was looking at this stage. The orange mix was just a little too orange, and there was no gradient between the colours. And I had the idea again to layer over with the red paint and red ink mix, but I accidentally picked out the ink bubble on my palette and layered pure ink over the top, which worked really nicely. By using just a tiny amount and spreading it into a thin layer, it sort of became a glaze, a translucent layer that lets some of the layers below show through. Those harsh orange highlights became a far more subtle bright red, and the solid lines of the gradients were somewhat smoothed out. And I couldn't help but notice just how this red looks so vibrant, so strongly pigmented and bright. I took this picture with the brightness on my phone turned all of the way down, and yet still that red stands out. Realizing that there is so much to learn with inks, and I am barely scratching the surface, let's have a look at yellow. Yellow paint is notorious for being difficult to paint with, even more so than red, and so naturally the Commissar's uniform has both. It is, however, a subject that many painters have experimented with and come up with a great number of ways to make yellow paint give you the effect you want. The technique that I generally use is to underpaint with pink. As a light colour, pink gives the yellow layer above some brightness, but also is a warm colour, and so it can give some vibrancy with only a few layers of yellow above, as opposed to painting 10 or 15 layers if you're painting over white. So combining that technique with my thinning with inks technique, my first layer is a pink paint thinned with a tiny bit of yellow ink, paying attention to get the dilution correct. And it looks a whole heap more pale than I'm used to. Usually at this stage, with pink paint thinned with water, I have a light pink as you would expect. But by adding the yellow ink instead, this layer looks white. I feel I may end up with quite a few layers after all. But then, for the second layer here, I added some yellow paint to the mix, which is still mostly pink paint by proportion. And this went on, and the yellow leapt out. Of course, I can't let it look too good, and so a quick brown wash to tint the yellow areas, followed by just the yellow paint and yellow ink as a highlight colour, finishes that up into the effect that I'm after. At some point during the yellow, I realised I've missed some important spots of the uniform, the cap. And so I grab the head and repeat all of these steps for the cap, and the collar as well, as apparently that's part of the head. At this point I've learned all sorts about how paints behave when thinned with inks, but I'm still new to this, so I want some familiarity. I went back and forth with the cloak. Should I thin that with inks as well, so it visually matches the rest of the model? Or should I thin it with water so that it can match the rest of the army? I ended up ignoring which way would fit the best and which was the most consistent, as that's all so incredibly unimportant, and I instead went with the easy option. I've painted 40 Simmet cloaks by now, so I just got stuck in. Blue shadows, mixed greens, all of my spots, dots, stipples, spreckles and fleckles, with all of the rest of the paints from the model. Usually the speckles are painted with my leftover colours from the palette, and so some of these little spots have some ink inside. Others I'd run out or had dried up, so I refreshed with a little dollop of the paint thinned with water. And so all I need to do now is paint the skin and the model is done. Right? Right? Well, for anyone who's noticed, the time signature of the video is not close to the end, and the keen-eyed amongst you will have noticed that Gaunt's left hand has been AWOL throughout the episode so far. And just a few of you who've seen the sprue for the Gaunt's Ghost model may also realise that his left arm doesn't separate at the wrist. And this of course means I get to do one thing that I love to do when making videos: time travel. So, hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this is Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt, and I'll be painting the model, but first, I want to give this model some weapon options. Over his career, Gaunt has used a variety of weaponry, starting off as Cadet Commissar, then serving with the Hurricanes and the First Command with the Tanith First and Only. He used pretty standard Unitorum issue, chainsword and bolt pistol, which is how the model is depicted. Later on, after the Siege of Vervenhive, he is gifted the sword of Hieronymo Sondar, a right fancy power sword. I'm not the only one converting Gaunt to have the sword of Hieronymo, and some look amazing. But I'm gonna stay simple and use the spare power sword from the Officio Prefectus Commissar that I have used for Hark, which I still need to upload the video of. I'm sorry Hark, I'll get to it. During the Geryon mission later on, much of which is redacted, the super valuable posh pokey stick got put into storage, and Gaunt instead took a pair of bolt pistols as his primary armament. And I've got this bolt pistol from the Cadian Command sprue kicking about. After Geryon, he usually uses the sword of Hieronymo, but does occasionally use the pair of pistols, so I would like that option as well. But how do I choose between all these different options? Haha, well, with magnets, I don't have to choose. This is the first time I've used magnets for a mini, and it's somewhat of a meme at this point, with some people finding some excellent uses, and some people using magnets where they're totally inappropriate. Also, this is bonus points for the AOB challenge to try new techniques or supplies, so with both inks and magnets, I'm really playing with new ideas here. Maybe I do think that having a magnet in a wrist is probably not the best of ideas. It's likely to be just that little bit fragile. And of course I bought the magnets before the model arrived, so I didn't do the sensible thing and measure the model's wrist first. It turns out the model's cuff is just ever so slightly bigger than the magnet, so with some extreme care I can probably drill a hole to fit. One thing to be careful with when it comes to drilling is heat dissipation, as the friction caused by cutting gets hot quickly and you can end up melting the plastic without really trying. I drilled a sub-sized pilot hole, then slowly ate plastic away until it was wide enough for the magnet, and deep enough for two. With great care I did manage to do it without melting anything, although I did create a hole that we'll mention in a second. So I had the cool idea of using a stack of magnets wrapped in cling film, except for the magnet at the very end, which is outside of the film. I dropped some superglue into the bored out wrist and pressed the magnet stack into it. The plan is for the first magnet to be glued in, and then the film separates all of the rest. But I got distracted by this leaking superglue pouring out from the split where I drilled too close to the edge. I ran to grab some kitchen roll and soak off the superglue. Don't dab it or wipe it away, it'll just crystallise and create a horrible texture. Instead, hold the kitchen roll in the superglue and let it soak in through capillary action. This little disaster is somewhat self-sealing. With the magnet inside and the superglue everywhere, it's all just a solid block now. But there was another issue that was caused here. I drilled the hole for the depth of 2 magnets, then the second one will be glued to the hand, but it needs the recess for that to actually fit and be hidden. Because of my rush in dealing with the leaking superglue, I wasn't holding the magnets down, and so it's not quite as deep as I had intended. We can take a look at how that ended up in the hero shots at the end of the episode. For now, let's look at my trick for ensuring that magnet polarity is correct. With the wrist side magnet fixed in place, I will cover it with cling film and place a second magnet on top, which will naturally attract to the correct side and hold in place. A dot of superglue onto the wrist of the chainsaw hand and press that into the magnet, and once cured, it should all be correct. And repeat that process for the power sword. For the second bolt pistol, I have some extra kit bashing to do. The hand holding the pistol is a right hand, where I need it to be a left hand. So I'll cut away the bolt pistol from the hand, with quite some care to not split the thumb in half. I've made that mistake before. And I looked for a left hand holding any type of firearm grip, and I couldn't find one. Nobody's left-handed, except orcs, it seems. Instead I found this archer's arm from the old Warhammer Empire set. It's holding the bow at an angle quite similar to a pistol's grip, and so by cutting off the bow at the right angle, gluing all the parts together and attaching the magnet, I think this works well enough. And all I needed to do was paint the hands and the weapons, and the face as well. And painting these tiny pieces was quite difficult. It's too small for blue tack to hold them, and they kept rotating around the magnet even when I attached it to this metal bar. With some effort and some care and some patience, I did manage to get them sorted. For the face, I've talked about faces in other videos recently, and this one's long enough as it is. The face didn't come out perfectly, but it's on par with the rest of the painting of the set, so I'm probably happy with that. The last thing, I promise you it's the last thing, is painting the power sword. The relic that is the sword of Hieronymus Sondar. With these inks that I've been practicing with this model, I realised that the inks are vibrant, but still translucent, which gave me an idea. If I wet blend some swordy highlights into the grey and white, I could then throw on just a single layer of ink on top, which should leave a rich bright blue, but still with those highlights visible. Once again, this is something you can look at in the hero shots in a moment, because I need practice with this. I think I need to go all the way down into black and use a bit more white as well. So, at last, at long fething last, I'm done. The model that took me nearly a week, with about 5 hours of hands-on painting time between other things. Compared to the older model, he's standing upright. It's far more visible. But he's also a bit out of scale, standing at 35mm. Particularly, I'm seeing the improvement in my own painting style. From the old Gaunt I painted nearly a year ago, to new Gaunt, with all of the practice, experience and techniques and supplies, I have improved this much. Who knows where I'll be in another year. And I've even got weapon options. The original chainsword, the sword of Hieronymus Sondar, and a Kimbo paired bolt pistol, and yes, I know that the two pistols are different sizes, shush. I could easily work out the points for changing these weapons around in game, but I mean that would require me caring about the rules, which is unlikely. Please check out my playlist of Gaunt's Ghost videos. I've been showing as many methods for making the cloaks, as well as other modelling techniques, parts and supplies for making a Tanith army. Also all of the other YouTubey things, there is a comment section for asking questions, a description with links to my other stuff. And with all that said, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and with a video this long, thank you very much for watching.